Welcome. Good evening, everybody. I'm Julia Landau. I'm a lawyer at Mass Advocates for Children, and thanks so much for being here. We're thrilled that tonight, due to popular demand of issues that people were most wanted to hear, we're really fortunate that Kelley Challen, who is the Director of Transition Services at NESCA, has agreed to come and speak with all of us tonight about how to address the transition needs of older youth with remote learning. Not an easy nut to crack. Not that any of this has been very easy for students and families in these most trying times. We did a poll last week, and the consensus seemed to be to lengthen the time to 45 minutes, kind of trying to reach a compromise between what everybody wanted. So this talk will go 45 minutes. We hope you can stay for the whole thing. Of course, if you need to leave early, that's fine. Just to remind you, this is being recorded, and Lilia Malecki, who's up on the top of the screen, will be reviewing all your questions. If you go down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see the chat option and put your questions in there, and she'll help to raise those questions with Kelley at the end of her presentation. We're doing a brief poll now, just so we know more who's in the audience. So if you could fill out what brings you to this chat, if you're a parent, if you're an advocate, if you're an educator, if you're all three, please fill out the chat as we get started. Lily, is there anything I'm forgetting?
That's it. Thanks for filling out the poll. Yeah, just submit your questions in the chat box. I just put a message there. Thank you, everyone.
Great, thank you. And thank you again, Kelley, for being here tonight.
Thanks for inviting me. Should I be waiting for the poll, Lilia?
No, go for it.
Okay, so we're gonna be talking about transition services, and I'm gonna just sort of try to move through this quickly, but hopefully without not talking too fast, and then leave some time for questions.
Got a lot of parents on the call. Vast majority of you.
We do, but
Awesome.
We also have quite a few educators and advocates. So, and now it's not, of course, now it's not letting me advance. There we go. Okay. So I did first want to just do a little bit of defining some things and essentially, talking about what are transition services. So if you have a child with special needs, you're probably familiar with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA 2004. And that's certainly the law that guarantees that students with disabilities have an equal opportunity for free and appropriate public education, so FAPE. But it's also within this federal law that it's mandated for students on IEPs to be provided with transition assessment, goals, and services that prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. So this idea of transitioning to adulthood is really baked right into IDEA. And within the federal law, and especially in Massachusetts, our Department of Education emphasizes that students must also be prepared for community engagement as part of their independent living. So there's a lot that we're preparing students for. In terms of transition assessment, which is required, it's different from a lot of other kinds of assessment because it's really an ongoing process, and it includes formal and informal assessment measures, and they have to be age-appropriate measures. So oftentimes when we're thinking about transition assessment, we focus on the three following referral questions. Discerning a student's post-secondary goals. In other words, their goals for after they've exited public education. So that's different than annual goals. We're looking to gain an understanding of the student's needs, strengths, preferences, and interests. So it's not just deficit-based. We're really looking at what are the student's strengths, what do they like to do, where can we build from, and we're measuring their performance through transition assessment. In comparison to a lot of other types of assessment, which are quite difficult to carry out right now, transition assessment is one of the easiest types of assessment, in my opinion, to carry out remotely for students with a wide range of developmental and learning profiles. If the school's carrying out assessment for your child involving staff who are most familiar and have the best rapport with the student, tends to be one of the most important factors in getting accurate results. Right? If you're trying to figure out what a student really likes, it helps if you have somebody who's familiar with the student who can tell when they're telling the truth. So that tends to be really important. There's lots of common formal and informal transition assessment tools. Everything that I've listed here on this slide is something that could be used remotely. Especially things like structured interviews, parent and teacher questionnaires, rating scales, and plenty of student self-report measures. I did put an asterisk by vocational skills tests because there are some computer-based vocational aptitude tests that are designed to be completed independently by a student, but those are often only appropriate for students who meet language and attention demands of those tests. And so there are a lot of other vocational aptitude tests that are wonderful, but would be less safe or appropriate to carry out in the current conditions. So let's think about transition services that can be delivered right now. There are lots of ways that schools are still able to carry out transition services remotely. Students who have had life skills instruction at school or home services as part of their IEP can certainly still continue this service. If occupational therapy or ABA services were needed to support life skills instruction at school, those services can continue at home, although they might look quite a bit different remotely. If a student's taking a personal finance or consumer skills class, or maybe has budgeting or money skills unit as part of their curriculum, they can continue this learning at home remotely through live instruction, if that's being provided, recorded lessons. There's some wonderful online interactive curricula. Paper worksheets can still be, mailed home. Interactive worksheets can be created online. So there's a lot of ways to continue working on those money skills. It's pretty common for students to have some sort of work around grocery shopping or meal planning or cooking as part of life skills training. And if students were cooking at school, they can practice cooking the same recipes at home. There's a generalization opportunity here. Students might be able to start learning to purchase groceries online using Instacart or Amazon Prime Now, or a resource that's available to family. I would say if we're working on transitioning life skills from school to home, it's really important for parents and teachers to be communicating and collaborating around this. A parent may not want a student to be using their Instacart account with a credit card attached because student might just buy 15 boxes of Oreos, or whatever preferred food is. So it might be better to link it with a gift card as opposed to a parent's credit card. And then with kids at home all day, it's really important that you have read your recent progress reports closely, that you've talked with your student's teacher, and that you know what your child's capable of carrying out for life skills so that they're continuing to do some of those activities at home. I was just talking with a colleague yesterday who's a transition specialist, and she's had to coach a number of parents that she works with to stop making lunches for their students, because as part of their program, they've been making lunch for themselves every single day during the school year. And so she's, having to remind families that these young adults and teens know how to make their own lunches, and they need to be given the opportunity to keep doing that. It may not be as pretty, but it's really important to allow for some of that continuity. In terms of community engagement, I've seen some really creative things happening. So if you're on any sort of social media platform, you've probably seen plenty of posts about virtual field trips to museums or state parks. Yosemite is a big one I've seen a lot, aquariums, other landmarks that can be accessed for free. And so many educators are taking advantage of these opportunities in lieu of typical community outings. So if students had, say a community trip every single Friday as part of their program, or it was part of their IEP, teachers can still lead virtual field trips. They could start with discussions about the travel that would be needed to get to and from the trip, the types of questions students might ask while they're on the field trip, maybe talk about the behavioral expectations, social expectations for visiting the location, take the virtual trip together, and then process the trip afterward. Some high school and transition classes are partnering together within a district or across districts so that students are able to have those experiences in a larger group. These could also be completed as inclusive activities. For instance, a visit to the US Constitution could still be part of a gen ed history class. and lots of students could be included. In terms of social engagement, this is an excellent opportunity to work on learning to use technology and social media to connect socially with others, right? So there's so many more opportunities for practicing text messaging, phone skills, video conference skills, or other age-appropriate social media technologies. So there's a really good opportunity to actually build some communication skills that maybe have been underutilized, but are certainly part of IEPs for many students. And then for school programs that have relied heavily on real-life exploration of community resources, which is often a big part of transition planning, is sort of getting students out into the real world to practice skills. You know, many classes may have been going on shopping trips every single week, or visiting the library, or touring other local resources. And so teachers are having to get a bit more creative. So, you know, rather than taking a visit to local police department to learn about law enforcement, students might do a virtual interview with the police chief and use something like Google Earth to explore what the building looks like from the outside or how to get there. If you're used to going to Target, instead of actually going on the store, you might still have a shopping list and actually download the maps of Target, you know, from the app or the website, and then be going through figuring out where the items are, what department they're in. So you can still be practicing a lot of those community skills, even though you can't get out into the community right now. One important consideration that may or may not be listed as a transition service on the IEP is community service. Most of our public schools have community service graduation requirements for students before they graduate, before they exit high school. I have seen a lot of these requirements being waived or eliminated for all students right now. But there's a good number of volunteer activities that can actually still be done remotely, such as mentoring or being a virtual companion for a senior citizen, fundraising, etc. I did put a link. There's going to be a resource sheet that I've put up on Mac's website, and I put a link to a website that's all about volunteering for teenagers in the age of COVID-19, and I would definitely encourage talking with your team about how to still fulfill volunteer requirements rather than waiving it, because it's just a really important part of community engagement. Schools should definitely also continue to be connecting students with community agencies that are offering supports, especially those agencies that will be available or necessary for engagement after graduation, right? For instance, independent living centers have been running some wonderful social groups right now, and peer mentoring experiences. Adult human service agencies are still doing orientations, intakes, taking 688 referrals. Although services definitely vary by office and by agency and even by staff member, it's important to check that your school team has been in touch with the Adult Human Service Office, and that there's a clear process for managing referrals between school and adult services at this time, and just sharing information about what resources are available. In terms of employment, many students do have, say, a career exploration goal on their IEP, and those can be carried out usually as they're written. So students might be able to take career interest inventories that are online, do career research, report on career research in a portfolio, or present to classmates via video conference, or record, you know, information, create a PowerPoint. There are lots of objectives that can be carried out just as they're written at home. Resume writing is certainly something that's easy to continue working on. You can use document sharing for corrections or adding, you know, assignments as part of that. Students who'd been planning to apply for summer jobs or jobs in the community, even though it's not clear if we're going to be, you know, having the same employment opportunities this year, they could still be supported in going through most of the steps in that process, right? Finding applications, reading the criteria, preparing the application materials, practicing interview schools, essentially getting to where they're ready to go as soon as it becomes safe and appropriate to be applying for whatever the job was that was of interest to the student. Real life job exploration activities like worksite visits or informational interviews can still be carried out remotely. They can be done by, you know, connecting with the same community partners who've typically hosted students on tours before. Some educators are also making use of other online video job exploration tools that might be available through like the One Stop Career Center, or within whatever transition curriculum the school has, or another similar resource. And then for students who have had like pre-vocational training or maybe volunteer or paid employment as a transition service, it is really important to continue practicing whatever technical skills the students had learned previously so that they're not losing transferable skills. So if a student was doing mail delivery as part of a job at school, they might be able to continue, retrieving mail at home, sorting mail for their family. Certainly it requires parent and teacher working together to think about, what the skills were that the student was specifically using as part of their job and how that could be creatively carried out at home. And then, teachers may be needed to create a system, visual, other natural supports so that the student can be as successful and independent in carrying out that task at home, but maintaining that skill so they can go right back in and pick up where they had left off at some point. Many students would have also been referred for pre-employment transition services, pre-ETS, through Mass Rehabilitation Commission. I wrote it on the slide, good, Massachusetts Rehabilitation Commission. I don't like when people use acronyms and don't explain them, so I'm glad I did that. Or a local vendor, and families should still be provided with information and introduction to these agencies so that they can be taking advantage of the pre-ETS services that are being delivered right now remotely. A lot of the vendors that I have been in touch with or that some of the students I'm working with are using still seem to be delivering individual and group sessions using Zoom or Skype, FaceTime, or phone calls for students. So these pre-ETS services are certainly still being delivered, and students can be referred for those if that's supposed to be part of the process for those students. And then I did just put this slide in here because many students have an IEP objective or a line in their transition action plan that talks about applying to appropriate post-secondary programs, but might not be explicit about the types of programs. And I wanted families to be able to think about all the different options that might be appropriate to explore as transition services are being delivered. Something that's not on here, but that many students are thinking about right now are gap year experiences. But these are a lot of the institutions that you might be looking into. And I did include some resources on the resource list that you'll be getting on the after the presentation so that you can explore post-secondary learning and training programs at home if that's something that's of interest. I think a lot of families have been interested in doing that over this summer, especially not knowing what summer programming might look like. And then in terms of thinking about what can be done right now, if an IEP or a transition plan talks about a student taking part in a guidance curriculum as part of their transition services, the school should be finding ways to continue delivering typical guidance curriculum remotely. And families should have an understanding of how coursework is going to be selected for next year. Some students may have been doing initial college searches at this time in their programming, and that should still be carried out. And even before this period of sheltering in, many colleges and universities already offered virtual tours, or tours of the colleges could be found on third-party websites. And now more colleges are rolling out virtual tours and orientation materials. Just in the last week, I've received several emails about virtual orientations for inclusive college programs and transition programs, like the Threshold program, say over at Leslie. And staff can certainly still continue to support students in taking individual or group tours and having the students complete evaluations of the programs. Some schools will take students for a visit to disability support services at a community college or a four-year college. And these types of meetings and information sessions about the transition from high school to college supports are definitely still possible remotely. And then while a lot of PSATs have been pushed to fall for schools that sometimes offered them in the spring, students might take practice SAT exams right now so that they're sort of still getting that experience in about the same time period and having the opportunity to figure out if that kind of testing might be something that's going to be useful for them. And while this isn't usually part of a transition service that would be happening in the spring, I do want to just point out that some students who are in 11th grade may want to start looking at actual college applications or writing college essays so that they have an idea of how to move through that process quickly in August and then sort of leave more time open in the fall, because I think we're going to be catching up a lot academically, right? And possibly it's just going to take a lot more energy than we're used to it taking. Some students may be enrolled in Inclusive College or MACI programs right now, which is the Mass Inclusive Concurrent Enrollment Program. And I know that some of these programs have been rethinking how to best support students during the period of sheltering in. There should be outreach between the student and the college staff and the high school contact who've been facilitating the program to date. And given that MACI programs are intended to be inclusive and promote social engagement, I've seen some programs might be offering other social opportunities like group gaming online or individual check-ins with staff or mentors or other activities that are related to the design of the program. And then I am also working with a number of students who are dually enrolled in college courses. And for some students, they've been able to manage the shift to remote learning well and had, support. I think other students may not be successfully passing their classes, partially due to a big shift in format or other things. And so students, because we don't know what college learning is going to look like in the future, students who are preparing for college may need to be preparing to manage remote college classes. So they might need to now retake some coursework to build those skills to be ready for sort of whatever's next. I do want to just point out that self-determination, right, sort of the student being involved in making decisions and choices for themselves as much as possible has to be a central part of any transition service delivery going on. And given that instruction's being reduced by half, some transition services will necessarily have to be cut out, and students should really be allowed to make decisions about what they want to be learning on and focusing on. So I did put a couple of choice boards on here, which are basically graphic organizers that a lot of schools are using really across the country. And students can choose to complete, one or several of the activities on a choice board, could complete them in order. And so I put some of these examples on here. One's from Teachers Pay Teachers on the left, which is a nice resource. And then the second one's from Teacher Vision. And it just gives some ideas of how a student might, have 9 choices that are all going to be related to, learning about the community, but they get to sort of pick the order that they're going to learn those things in. And then just thinking about some different considerations when we're thinking about, really remote learning at home, but also transition service delivery at home. And learning at home is definitely different than learning at school. Some students are having tremendous difficulty making this leap, and so they may respond better to working on life skills activities than to academic instruction at home. There are a lot of great web-based resources being offered for free right now. And if you notice that materials that are being used are not age appropriate, you should immediately address that with your team. Some students will certainly need direct instruction or more or less direct instruction than is being offered for general ed. And you got to talk to your team if the schedule is not meeting your child's needs and you need help prioritizing the activities. And if you notice some activities are easier for your child to complete without support, even if it's only 10 minutes without support, let a teacher know that. See if you can increase some of those activities. Also, certainly if you need training or have questions or see needs for your child that are important and aren't being met, ask for it and be specific. And so that's where I'm going to end with my presentation and give some time for you all to ask your questions.
Okay, thank you everyone for submitting your questions. Let's get right into it. Thank you, Kelley. We had a few people ask this question. Working on independent skills at home for students who have one-on-one support and need constant redirection and reminders means that parents must have the time to provide this direct support. But many parents are working full-time remotely from home. Schools expect parents to be able to pull this off, but it's just not realistic for a lot of people. Do you have any advice for those parents?
I think it definitely comes down to, well, number one would be talking with school to see to talk about that challenge, right? So first it's sort of just addressing, here are the expectations, but here's what real life looks like in my household, and really trying to figure out what are the resources, again, that the school has that can support trying to make the life skills instruction work at home. If a student's needing hand-over-hand support, that's something that's just complicated and may not be something that can be provided at this point in time. But if it's needing somebody to be there remotely to be prompting a student through things, there might be someone who has capacity to do that. A lot of students had paraprofessional support or job coach support or other things like that. And so first checking in to make sure that to see what there, whether there are more resources that can be provided because the skill development isn't working at home. I think there is also a huge need for prioritization, and certainly as a parent, you want to think about what's going to be, what's doable, what's going to be most helpful in the household right now. I mean, most of our students have, sort of a list of 15 life skills that they should be working on, and so figuring out the ones that are going to be, the 5 that you're going to work on is one way to think about it. You're not going to be able to get through all of them, but you need to make sure you have the resources from the school that you can, and then either prioritizing on your own based on what you want to see in your household, but you may also need to talk to the teacher about what is most important to prioritize at this time. And it could be that more visuals or other things are needed. There may be some other materials, or there were things that were being used to prompt a student at school that could be replicated at home. I mean, it really has to be collaborative when we're trying to transfer some of this skill development to a totally new environment. You're muted, Julia.
Muted. Oh.
Sorry. Those are all really great points and things to think about. The things I would add on to what Kelley was saying, which really kind of build on the points that she was making, are one, how important it is. I mean, the parents who are home juggling so many things clearly have limited time, limited resources. Many parents have more than one child who they're trying to support in terms of their remote learning and remote instruction. And at the same time, schools are trying to do things that have never been done before. How do you do all this remotely? So in addition to there's 2 points I would add or just emphasize on what Kelley said. One is it's going to be so important that you creatively with the team figure out how to address these challenges. It's clearly going to be really difficult learning all types of skills for kids who need a lot of one-to-one instruction. And nobody has the answers right now, and there may not be answers, but for some students there will be some. And the commissioner sent out some new guidance about remote instruction for all kids last week, and what was really emphasized was the need to have staff who are working in a very individualized way to figure out what are the barriers for certain kids and how to creatively address them. So they need your input. And secondly, document what is working and what isn't working. You can we've talked about this in other sessions, you can take videos, you can take notes. We're going to have an app we hope to release by the end of next week that'll help to document things. But that will help them to see what is and isn't working now to try and problem solve it, and will also help when schools reopen to find out what, if any, compensatory or other services might be needed. Because it can't be the same as when schools are open. That's the sad thing about this.
And the interesting thing about transition services is that transition services are often a lot of the activities that the team has already agreed the student really needs to be able to be prepared for post-secondary life. And so we know we can't do all of them right now, right? We know that we've already sort of reduced education by a certain amount. So you do want to be keeping track of what are the services that we knew the student needed that they couldn't get in this spring, because we certainly want to find a way for them to get that in before they exit public education if possible, right?
Thank you both. We have a few different people asking this question. Is there any talk of extension for kids with moderate to severe disabilities extending past 21 years old? There's a lot of students who are turning 20 or who are 20 now and are missing out on critical transition services now. Is there any talk of extensions?
I think there's a lot of questions about what's going to happen for all kids, for kids without disabilities and for kids, who do have disabilities who are missing so much education. Part of what was in the Department of Ed's new guidance last Friday was very, very explicit direction to school districts that what they should be focusing on is the instruction that's needed for all kids, including kids with disabilities, that's going to help them be able to learn the skills they need to move on to the next level, you know, to move on to the next grade, or, you know, for kids who are transitioning out, I would extend that to say the skills they need to be able to successfully move on in terms of meeting their transition goals. And there's been a lot of discussion about what it's going to mean for all kids in terms of is there going to be additional time at the beginning of the year or at the end of the year. We're not even exactly sure when schools are going to open yet, which makes it hard to plan. So again, the importance of staying in close communication, and to the extent you've got the time and capacity, documenting what your child is and is not getting and how they're doing will help, because the state and the federal government will be giving more guidance when schools reopen to exactly address your questions. How do you figure out whether or not kids are entitled to additional time and additional services to make up for what they didn't have? It's going to be an individual determination, kid by kid, but it's clearly something that's being thought about and considered, and we're going to get more guidance. But that's why it's so important that you're staying in close communication now and trying to keep track of what is going on. So like so much of this, there's not absolutely clear-cut answers, but we know what's going to be important for you to be thinking about as you look at what your kids need. Kelley, you have anything to add?
No, just the point that adult human service agencies are working right now, and they're working remotely. And so, you know, it's, I think, as important, especially if you have a child who's, you know, within 2 years of exiting public education, but especially if it's within a couple of months, to make sure that, you know, your team is also working with your adult human service agency, and that you've got your referral already made or in process, so that you can be talking with another agency about what support's available now and over time.
I see a related question. Lily, am I able to jump in on a question I see that's related?
Yeah.
That you don't read? Somebody's asking about what if schools reopen when students who have turned 22. The same principle would still hold. You know, if when schools reopen, you have a child who's turned 22 and you feel that the impact of the education they haven't been able to receive may well require some additional services, those are all going to be fair and important things to raise with the school district. And I think the school districts anticipate that. That's why the school districts, as well as families, know that they're going to need to get guidance from the state and feds about how to look at all these determinations about what kids need additional services. Doesn't mean it'll necessarily be easy, but I think there is going to be guidance that's going to make it more clear, because it's clear this is having a very significant impact on many kids.
Thank you. Next question, what about extended school year services for summer? Can a parent find a program and ask the school to pay for it if available this summer?
I'm not sure exactly what the question means. If your child has a need for extended school years in their IEP, and if the shelter-in-place order is lifted, then your school district should be providing that in not remotely, right, but in person. So I'm not sure if the question means if the shelter-in-place requirement is still in place. I'm not sure what privately would be available that's not publicly available, but I may be misunderstanding the question. Kelley, do you have another?
Well, I'm going to try a different interpretation, but I could also be misunderstanding. I do think that I'm a parent as well as a professional, and I think, you know, initially there was some thinking like, okay, if we're going to miss some of this school year, perhaps we can make things up over the summer, right? And so if the idea is, you know, if my child's not getting a certain amount of services now, could I find a different program and ask the school to pay for that program? That becomes pretty complicated, because as Julia was just saying, we're not really going to be able to talk about compensatory services for students until we get, you know, sort of through the period of sheltering in and we're back into a period where we're regularly having team meetings. And so to be able to ask for something more for summer is fairly complicated. There may be situations to have that discussion with your team, but that's certainly not going to be a regular discussion that a lot of teams would be having.
And again, I know school districts across the board are trying to think about with their unions, whether for all kids, if schools can open, will they be providing more services over the summer? So I think these are all really important questions. If things do open up in the summer and there's nothing, it's completely appropriate if you can identify something that you think is going to address the compensatory needs of your child. It's completely appropriate to advocate for that. It just, there's so many moving parts right now. It's hard to know what legal posture we're going to be in by summer. But people are going to have to look at creative ways to try to address kids' needs. So it's possible things over the summer are certainly on everybody's mind, I think.
I do think sometimes there are informal transition services that happen over the summer as part of students' IEPs. For instance, I know travel training is often something that ramps up over summer months. So if there are certain transition services that you were expecting a student to get this summer, whether those are sort of formally in your IEP or not, those are certainly things to be discussing with your team in terms of ways to make sure that those can continue. I think that's all.
We just got a question in the chat box about putting out a survey to gather data on this. MAC did actually just come up with a survey to gather information about barriers to remote learning. I can include that in the email we send out tomorrow. Julie, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, and if this is the same chat question that I'm seeing right now, it's the question was also spot on, because it's saying this is all educators, psychologists, behaviorists, everybody around the state, around the country is quickly trying to develop strategies to teach kids effectively and provide special ed services effectively. And so the our State Department of Education is very much realizing and emphasizing that they need to play an important role in pulling together best practices and sharing them across districts, which I think part of what the question I'm looking at is talking about. So whether it's around transition services and strategies that work remotely, or ways to address communication skills or social skills, or kids who use AAC, that is something that the Department of Ed has realized that they can play a really important role with. And because you don't want everybody to keep reinventing the wheel over and over and over as we figure out how to make the wheel turn more effectively.
Switching gears a little bit, for kids who have trouble generalizing from a virtual environment to a real life environment, how accurate are assessments being done now, I guess?
Well, the assessments wouldn't necessarily be virtual. I mean, I think that's why I'm saying transition assessments are a little bit easier to carry out than other kinds of assessments, right? So, like occupational therapy assessments are virtually impossible to do because you need to really be looking at, students' fine motor and things like that and be able to manipulate a student. But the transition assessment, it's not so much that it's being completed virtually. Some of the activities we do are things like interest inventories, right? So I'm asking a student, on a scale of dislike or unsure or like, how do you feel about, I don't know, painting a wall, right? That might be an example of a question on an interest inventory. And that's not about whether I'm talking to a student online or interviewing them via paper. That sort of has a lot to do with how well I understand whether the answers the student's giving me are accurate. And so that might have to do with involving a parent in the process. That might have to do with having the teacher evaluate the student who just knows that student really well and already has rapport. Some students are doing really well with this sort of video conference interface. And in fact, some students actually, this is a better medium for some students with social cognitive deficits than in person. So it's really interesting because you may get better results for some kinds of transition assessments than before. If it's, that's what, like with something like employment testing and career aptitude testing, again, some of those are standardized for computer administration. And so they're very accurate and valid to be delivered on a computer, but it again, depends on the ability of the student to be able to whether that's the appropriate assessment for the student, right? So I hope I'm answering that well. I mean, one of the things that is kind of frustrating this period of time is that a great aspect of transition assessment is when you can do observations of students, and especially observations of students in real life settings, like in a shopping mall, on a college campus, in their classroom, in their home. That's really hard to do right now in a safe way. And so there's certainly pieces missing, but there's a lot of information you can get from the teachers, parents, providers who have seen students in those settings within the last 6 months, as far as being able to build a pretty accurate picture of a student's functional skills at this point in time. So I'd say that a lot of great data can still be gotten in terms of what we're trying to figure out about a student being ready to make transitions to next stage of life.
Great, thank you. Follow-up question to that: can schools refuse to conduct evaluations on the grounds that we can't get accurate data because they're being conducted virtually?
Another issue that is being discussed and thought about a lot, and I am very confident we're going to be getting more guidance over time from the state about that. I think that where it falls kind of technically and legally is that school districts are required to do as much of an initial evaluation or a reevaluation or a transition assessment as is possible technically. There's a lot of pieces that may be possible. There may be the pieces of the inventory. There may be pieces of things that they have from other assessments from outside providers that they could consider. There's, the education assessment should be able to be conducted by the existing teacher of the child, based on their experience with the child before March 17th, I think was the date when this all happened, and their experience remotely. There may be some protocols of certain types of assessments that currently are not considered valid if they're done remotely. However, what's considered valid now, I predict, and others predict in the field, is going to be different over time, because a lot of clinicians are trying to work with the test developers, or what's the right word, Kelley, to figure out, everybody's trying to figure out how to do this way that's accurate. And so I think, depending on how long this goes, depending on if there's a second wave, I think everybody's realizing that they have to think about tools that are going to be reliable and effective long-term. And I think we're also advocating for the fact that if there's enough information to at least make an initial determination about what a child's needs are, then the school district should be required to address those needs, knowing that they may have to do further evaluations later when schools open. So again, this is all new, but I think that it's very important and legally required to do as much as is possible.
I do think in a couple of weeks, the Federation's going to be doing a talk on remote evaluations that my colleague Ann Helmus is going to be participating in terms of at least thinking about how cognitive and psychological and some other kinds of testing may or may not be able to be carried out. I mean, it is tricky because certainly any of these professionals have guidelines and ethics, and there's a lot that goes into thinking about how they're testing students, and many of these standardized procedures just were not designed to be delivered remotely. And having been at a practice where we tried doing a lot of testing on an iPad, and for many reasons found that it added some challenges, we ended up going back to doing all of our testing paper-based for students so that we could get the most accurate pictures of students, at least as far as our neuropsychological evaluations. But I think we're now sort of moving back into trying to figure out what pieces are safe and appropriate to deliver, remotely or at an appropriate social distance, things like that. So I think Julia's right. We're going to see shifts in terms of tests potentially being designed or modified so that we can try to get as much information about students as possible. in whatever stage we're in as far as social distancing over the next year or so.
And I think it also becomes more important, if there's reports or assessments from outside clinicians or developmental pediatricians. I know in non-COVID times, it can often be very difficult to get school districts to, in some situations, to really fully consider outside assessments. But I think this is an environment when hopefully they're going to be more receptive to things that have been done, since they have a limited ability right now to do things on their own.
Thank you both. Quick follow-up to that, can tests like the BASC3 and the BRIEF, BRIEF, be done?
So
I don't know if
I
I'm
can
saying
tell
those
you,
correctly.
we talked about this in our case conference on Tuesday. So, gosh.
Do you want to explain to people what those are first?
Oh,
Kelley?
yeah. So we're talking about standardized rating scales, right? So rating scales that might be filled out by teachers or parents. Now, some rating scales ask the rater to think about over the last 6 months, sort of how often have you seen a student demonstrate this behavior or something else. If we think about students who were in school for 4.5 months and out of school for 6 weeks, you could still get a lot of information using those rating scales. There are other rating scales that say, hey, we want you to tell us about this student in the last 30 days. Well, we might ask it, the person filling out the rating scale, maybe you want to think about the student over the last, 60 days. But when you're making any shifts to sort of standardized administration of something, you have to also be able to account for that in your interpretation of the tool. And so it's not just a case of valid or invalid. It has a lot to do with what are the interpretations you're making of that information after the fact, right? I might give a brief that has a whole bunch of standardized questions about executive functioning on it, and then I might qualitatively interpret that data. I might look at how a teacher was rating a student's ability to pay attention or keep impulsive comments in, or have their materials for class. I mean, that's still really important information. For that particular tool, it does have a span of 6 months, so it's also still valid at this point in time. So yes, there's a lot of utility to those questionnaires. The challenge is going to be those questionnaires are going to be much less valid in September if they're teacher scales. Now we're in an interesting situation where parents are seeing students 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So parent data becomes much more important. We're not in a situation where schools have students 30 hours a week and are sort of the primary educators of the students. So I think these tools are still valid, but we may be asking the parent to fill out the school form and the parent form and see if there's any differences there. It's sort of really interesting to think about these things, but it's not usually sort of just an A or B answer. It does have a lot to do with how you're administering it and how you're interpreting it. But I do think it's fascinating, because parent data is certainly much more important educationally and will continue to become more important educationally because they're so involved in the process right now.
Absolutely true.
Okay. We have one last question. We're at 45 minutes, but I wanted to get this one in, and I'll put information in the chat box as well for contacting our helpline if we weren't able to get to your question today. Last question. Is it reasonable to expect teachers to have regular meetings with your student so they can provide explicit instruction so the student can access work being sent home?
Great question. These are all great questions. And one thing to say before we close, I can't believe we've already gone over 45 minutes, but we know we haven't been able to answer all the questions. So please remember, I don't know if Lily, if you've provided information about our helpline, but if we have questions or questions impacting your child that we haven't gotten to, please feel free to email or call our helpline so we can try to answer your questions. So whether or not school districts should be doing something more individualized if a child's having difficulty accessing remote instruction or engaging, the answer is always been clearly yes, but because of the recent guidance sent out by the state last week, it is an unequivocal yes. The state has said very clearly for all kids, including kids with disabilities, the districts need to be really focusing on the needs of kids who are not able to really fully engage in accessing the remote instruction. And they list a variety of things that school districts should be considering based on what the needs of the child are. Assigning paraprofessionals, of assigning support staff or counselors, or figuring out who is the child's most comfortable with and can connect with, and setting up some ways to provide some individualized support. They talk about considering direct one-to-one support that might be needed. So it's very clear. They really emphasize the need to build positive relationships with kids to help them stay engaged and to figure out what the barriers are. So again, whoever's got that question, if there's something particular for your child, we can point to you where in this guidance or that information is that might be helpful as you advocate with your school district. So I guess we're done. I can't, at least from our perspective, this has gone really quickly. Kelley, we cannot thank you enough. This has been terrific information. I think everybody's gotten a huge amount out of it, a lot to think about. These are great questions, hard to have clear answers because everybody's figuring this out educationally and legally in these trying times. And it's because of your involvement and your expertise about your kids that kids will get at least as much as they possibly can in these trying times. So thanks so much for joining us, and watch a good TV show or have a glass of wine or do something to end your night.
Thanks. Can I interrupt, Lily? I do want to say thank you to you, Lily, and to you, Julia, and definitely to Mass Advocates for you guys really sort of leading the trailblazing here as we're all trying to figure this situation out. It's just been incredibly comforting professionally and as a parent to know that there's so many great people working on this and that we can kind of be trying to figure this all out together. I appreciate it so much.
Very kind. And thank you all, and have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to keep the chat box open for a little bit so you can submit. If anyone has suggestions for topics for future chats, please drop that in the chat box and we will take those into consideration. I'm also putting some information there for resources that we have. We'll be sending an email out to all registrants tomorrow with a recording of today's chat and the slides and the resource that Kelley shared and other resources from MAC. You can also visit massadvocates.org/events to see what our chats that we've done so far, the topics for those, and speakers and resources from those chats also. So please share any topic suggestions you have in the chat box and contact our helpline if we weren't able to get to your question today.
Yeah, the great resources you'll see from Kelley. It's a great dessert to this good conversation when you see those tomorrow.
All right.
I'm going to close out.
Yep, I'm going to go ahead and close it out. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.